X marks the spot, as the saying goes. You might even see a skull and crossbones of the Jolly Roger flying nearby. It could be in some creepy cemetery or some secluded secret place far, far away. At least that's the adventurous story that many will have heard as children. You may have even seen a skull and crossbones around, particularly if you're an avid cemetery explorer. I think of myself as pretty privileged having grown up in New Zealand. I spent a lot of my time outdoors in the bush or by the seaside, making spears and bow and arrows, getting up to all sorts of mischief, and things went pretty well for the most part. Certainly some pretty close calls. And I always remember being really inspired by books to go in search of adventure. And one that particularly stands out to me, and it might for many of you, is the story of Treasure Island. As I've got older, my adventures have led me to travel far from home, across the sea to new and confronting places. And whilst I haven't found any buried treasure so far, I've visited many old burial grounds and seen lots of examples of skull and crossbones. One of the aspects that I find really interesting about old cemeteries is the use of symbolism. And I should probably dispel any false hopes right now that skull and crossbones does not tend to signify buried treasure. The skull and crossbones, whilst they were adopted by pirates throughout the Middle Ages, were actually much more widely used. For the most part, it was and still is found carved on the tombstones in churchyard burial grounds. They were used as funerary symbols across Europe during the Middle Ages. Skull and crossbones were, in fact, part of a group of funerary decorations at that period, which included things like winged skulls, skeletons, or even hourglasses. Perhaps even the epitaph Memento Mori, remember, you must die. The Latin phrase less intended to remind people to die, and rather a kind of consolidation that we can remember that at one point we all will. Somewhat disappointingly, no buried treasure. But there are certainly treasures revealing the cultural and social attitudes towards death and the stylistic tastes of time. The symbols of Memento Mori aren't common depictions on graves these days, in fact haven't been for a couple of hundred years. They were largely replaced with more simplistic memorial designs, which usually had some kind of religious epitaph or something that speaks of the individual and probably the connection to their family. They may not signify that buried treasure is nearby, but they do allude to the wealth of knowledge that can be gained from studying cemeteries. Every aspect of the burial ground, from the memorials to the plants and the layouts of burials, gives insights into the views and the values of those buried within its boundaries. Hundreds of years on, the stones still give some voice to those who can no longer speak. They tell us selected details of the lives of these people that lived here once. I'd argue that Treasure Island, although it certainly is a swashbuckling adventure to find treasure, is itself also about more than just that. It's less about the protagonist Jim getting treasure and more about him going out, experiencing the world and learning to be an adult. It might seem a bit cheesy, but not everyone gets the opportunity to do that. That's definitely something these historic cemeteries remind us of.